Imagine it has been raining non-stop for 3 days. Your food is soaked. Your clothes are cold and wet. Every branch and twig around you is saturated and impossible to ignite. And right in the center of your shelter, there is a single glowing red ember, sitting beneath a bed of cold ash. If that ember dies, you might never be able to start another fire. How would you protect that tiny ember through hours of pouring rain, knowing it is your very last chance of survival? The most obvious answer, simply finding a way to cover the flames, doesn't actually tell the whole story. When we think about fire in the modern world, we usually assume it only exists in two simple states. It's either burning or it's out. But for ancient humans who truly understood fire, there was a third, much more important state fire that is sleeping, in the form of embers. A massive, roaring, bright campfire is actually extremely vulnerable to disaster. It consumes fuel at a ravenous pace, creates blinding smoke, is easily snuffed out by high winds, and demands constant feeding with dry wood. A protected bed of embers, on the other hand, burns much more slowly. It requires significantly less oxygen, is easy to shield, and can sit dormant for hours before being brought back to life with a dry bundle of tinder. Prehistoric humans didn't necessarily try to defeat a massive rainstorm by building a giant roaring bonfire to fight nature head-on. They only needed to preserve a living core of heat. In that unforgiving world, this wasn't just about tending a campfire. It was about preserving the ability to make fire again. Let's step back into the past, right before the very first drop of a storm hits the ground. Experienced ancient human groups didn't wait until they were soaking wet to take action. They read the signals of the natural world, dark clouds rolling in on the horizon, a sudden shift in wind direction, unusual animal behavior, or the heavy scent of damp earth rising into the air. Protecting the fire started at that exact moment. Immediately, a coordinated division of labor took place within the group. Some individuals quickly ran out to gather dry deadwood, still hanging in canopy branches, collecting bark, dry grasses, and securing food and tools in safe areas. Meanwhile, a smaller group focused their entire attention on the hearth. They began raking the glowing embers close together, shrinking the overall size of the active flame, and hurriedly packing up small earthen ridges around the hearth to block runoff water. Because rainwater doesn't just threaten a fire by falling from the sky. There are actually 3 devastating threats attacking their hearth simultaneously: direct rainfall, dousing the heat, howling winds stripping away the protective ash layer, and deadliest of all, cold surface water flooding across the ground and soaking the hearth from below. The very first line of defense against a storm wasn't putting a roof over the flame. It was choosing a location where running water simply couldn't reach. Prime natural landmarks were always the top priority: cave entrances, rock overhangs, cliff bases, or beneath dense forest canopies when it was safe to do so. In later historical periods, humans learned to construct sturdy shelters out of branches and animal hides. However, dragging a fire too deep inside a closed cave created another deadly hazard. Toxic smoke buildup with no ventilation, suffocating the group and forcing them out into the freezing rain anyway. Therefore, hearth placement was always a masterpiece of survival calculation. It had to be sheltered enough to avoid driving rain and wind, but with enough airflow for smoke to escape. Elevated on high ground to stay clear of surface runoff, yet not too close to the flammable materials of their shelter. Archaeological evidence from hearths inside rock shelters reveals that their positioning was never random. It was always tied to airflow dynamics and the spatial organization of the community's daily life. Of course, depending on the environment, the historical period, and the specific group of people, the solutions they adapted varied flexibly. When the storm finally hit and dragged on endlessly, ancient humans understood that trying to keep a large open flame burning was completely impossible and wasteful. Instead, they relied on a crucial survival technique, turning the flame into an ember bank. They deliberately let large logs burn down into glowing coals. then carefully raked that entire mass of thermal heat into a small, shallow depression dug into the earth. Next, they covered a portion of those coals with a blanket of cold ash. This ash acted like a miraculous shield. It prevented dripping rainwater from making direct contact, blocked out overpowering winds, yet still allowed a microscopic amount of oxygen to seep through to maintain a slow, smoldering reaction inside. Finally, they could lay larger logs over the top, creating a protective dome without suffocating the buried embers underneath. If an open roaring flame is like a high-drain appliance consuming energy at maximum speed, then an ember bank is nature's ultimate battery saver mode. The flames might have completely vanished in the dark, but the life of the fire was still pulsing silently beneath the ash. Yet, even if their ember bank survived intact, it would be completely useless if every piece of material around them was soaking wet. You cannot resurrect a fire from embers without bone-dry tinder. That is precisely why they had to safeguard a strict structure known as a fuel chain, starting from the most delicate flash ignition tinder to catch a thermal spark to tiny twigs, medium branches, and finally thick logs. Where did they hide these dry treasures? They stored them deep inside rock crevices, wrapped them tightly in bundles of fibrous bark, bundled them inside thick animal hides, or even salvaged the dry inner core of thick deadfall logs whose outer bark had been soaked by the rain. In later archaeological periods, evidence shows that many communities relied on specific fungal species as tinder. Most notably, the tinder fungus discovered at the La Draga site, or the fire-making kit carried by Utsi the Iceman. While organic remains from much earlier eras are rarely preserved, it is clear that identifying, processing, and storing dry tinder was a highly calculated and carefully prepared skill. Now, here is a reality that might surprise you. Sometimes the threat from a storm became so severe, a flooded cave, or depleting food supplies, that the entire group was forced to abandon their shelter in the middle of a freezing downpour. Under those conditions, they couldn't carry a bright open flame through the storm. Instead, they carried smoldering heat, a specially prepared slow-burning log, glowing embers safely packed inside a bed of ash within a bark bundle, or pieces of dried fungus capable of holding a smoldering coal for hours. They didn't need to haul a massive, cumbersome, easily extinguished bonfire. What they were really carrying was time. A slow-burning ember bought them precious time. Time to trek through the wilderness, to find a new cave, time to gather wood along the way. Time for the storm to weaken, and time to rebuild a life-saving fire once they reached safety. For a very long stretch of human dawn, using fire and actually knowing how to create fire did not emerge at the exact same time. Early human groups likely only harvested fire from natural wildfires caused by lightning strikes, keeping burning branches alive, and doing whatever it took to maintain that single flame from day to day, month after month. It wasn't until much later, when humans discovered how to strike flint against pyrite ores, to cast sparks, or used wood friction techniques to generate heat, that everything truly changed. Archaeological discoveries from 2025 at Barnum in the United Kingdom, or where marks on Neanderthal tools from 50,000 years ago hint at those monumental leaps forward. Once you had the ability to actively generate fire on demand, rain was no longer an absolute death sentence. Yet make no mistake, having to build a fire from scratch with freezing numb hands, howling winds, wet surroundings, and complete physical exhaustion remained a brutal, unforgiving ordeal. Knowing how to start a fire didn't make maintaining it meaningless. It just meant that losing your fire was no longer a permanent end. Out of this harsh survival rule, another marvel emerged within human society. Safeguarding the fire was never the job of a single isolated individual. One person simply couldn't hunt forage for wood watch. The children reinforced the shelter guard against predators and keep an eye on the glowing embers all at the same time. To keep a fire alive through days of violent storms, a group required a clear division of labor. There were strict rules about who was allowed to feed the hearth, meticulous transmission of skills from one generation to the next, and absolute trust among members to plan ahead for severe weather. Keeping a hearth burning across months and years wasn't just a physical achievement. It was the pinnacle of cooperation, discipline, collective memory, and cultural tradition. Perhaps fire didn't merely warm the bodies of our ancestral groups. Could it be that the relentless life-or-death pressure of keeping that flame alive actually helped bind and organize them into structured, tight-knit societies? Today, as the world has transformed, we no longer have to stay awake through the night to guard glowing embers beneath a freezing cave roof. Yet that ancient survival mindset still flows quietly through our veins. Notice your own immediate reaction when the power suddenly goes out during a massive storm. You instantly reach for the light of a flashlight. You worry about the temperature. You check your backup batteries, your food supplies, and the safety of your loved ones. Our technology has reached extraordinary heights. But that feeling of vulnerability, smallness, and uncertainty when facing sudden darkness, cold, and isolation has never truly vanished from the human psyche. We proudly declare that humanity has conquered fire, but looking back across the vast stretch of prehistoric time, fire had to be fed by our hands. Shielded from every drop of water, guarded through the dark, carefully carried across migrations, and demanded a treasury of knowledge, passed down with deep care through generations. So in the end, did humanity truly control fire, or did that life-saving flame quietly forge us, forcing us to become more organized, more patient, more deeply cooperative, and far-sighted just to survive? Ancient humans may have relied on countless ingenious methods to protect their fire from storms, from choosing smart shelters and reading water flow, to banking coals using cold ash as thermal insulation, hoarding dry tinder, or transporting smoldering embers across vast distances. But ultimately, the greatest secret to keeping a fire alive wasn't found in any single tool or clever technique. It was found in the unity and sheer willpower of a human group standing shoulder to shoulder to keep a fragile spark alive through the coldest, darkest nights. The next time you happen to see a tiny, fading ember, barely glowing in the dark, remember that throughout the long, epic history of humanity, that sight was never the end of a fire. It was always our final chance to start again. And all around us today, there are still countless ancient skills and profound truths hidden right inside the simplest, most ordinary things in our lives. Cave Curious is a YouTube channel dedicated to exploring the fascinating science and history of ancient humanity, wild animals, and prehistoric life. If you found this reflection on our primal past intriguing, consider subscribing to Cave Curious for more weekly explorations into the origins of human behavior and survival.